I've long since felt there was no phrase in sports punditry lazier or duller than, well, that team just wanted it more. If rugby matches only ever came down to who wanted it more, Wales would have just won a World Cup with me and the bloke from the Go Compare adverts, respective captain and goal kicker. It's just a phrase that reduces planning, preparation and uber smart cool-edged execution down to just who can hit their head against the wall the most. Modern rugby is a glorious mashup of passion and precision. It's like Tony Montana doing a buzzwire challenge. And yet, in all my endless hours spent watching mountainous meatmen meticulously mountain maim over an oval, and also my time watching rugby, no match has seemingly proven me as wrong on that one expression as Uruguay's 2019 Rugby World Cup win over Fiji. From Herman Kessler here pouncing on the loose ball to create Santiago Arata's opening try, to Nicolas Freitas chasing back on seemingly lost causes until his dying breath, to the post-match tears as Los Teros' own glorious captain, Juan Manuel Gabanara, so movingly put it.
I'm really proud of my country. We're not the biggest, we're not the tallest, but we came here to win. You saw the passion, you saw. I'm really proud.
It was clear, Uruguay just wanted it more. This was a 300-1 long shot that represents the second biggest upset in international rugby's 139-year history. This was a 15 of semi-pros without any superstars, beating a team that on talent was only a few black hoops away from being the 73 Barbars. And most importantly, this was a story Uruguay repeated, pushing Wales and Georgia and playing some really lovely rugby against Australia. This was a story that on the surface was all about passion. Uruguay's national anthem talks about dying in battle, and at times you seriously worried a few of their forwards were going to do that. Los Teros went from 40-point plus outsiders in every game, and some of them were 60, 70 points, to become the first team to ever win the Rugby World Cup in that opening pool game. To look at the table, it was a 113-point improvement on 2015, and to look at just the Fiji game alone, it was a 64-point improvement on the previous year. It's hard to argue that Uruguay wanted it more, and yet, if my endless meat man hours have taught me anything, and God, I hope they have, it's that you always need precision to back up that passion. This was a remarkable story, and for anything remarkable to become a story worth telling, you need detail. This was a story that began all the way back in 2014, when Uruguay, thanks in part to a superb performance by shiny centre Joaquim Prada, showed us exactly that passion to steal the final slot of the 2015 World Cup away from the much more fancied and then incumbents of that coveted 20th competition place, Russia. This game, an emphatic and impressive win over Vasily Artemyev's balmy Red Army, was Uruguay's entire World Cup campaign. They turned up to the tournament essentially unprepared. They were passionate, they belted out their anthem, they played with hands on hearts and hearts on sleeves, which is far more useful in a game of rugby than one of operation. They got off to a flying start against Wales, but then it all kind of crumbled. 35 tries conceded, 2 tries scored. Uruguay arrived at that World Cup with just 4 professional players, and with their most experienced individual from qualifying, the only player in their team who was regularly starting in a top league, veteran lock Rodrigo Cabra-Ortega, allegedly encouraged to retire from international rugby by his club cast ahead of the tournament, or faced the contract at the club where he'd just spent 12 years and in the town where he'd made a life for himself being torn up. This Uruguay squad were excited and proud to be there, but they weren't competing, and they knew this had to change. Shortly after the World Cup, the Uruguayan Rugby Union held a meeting with then Argentina coach Daniel Hocade. Hocade at the time was about as hot as any coach can be. He'd just guided his underdog side to their second World Cup semi-final and managed to combine a traditional Argentine grunt with a bodacious South American flair, making Argentina into the most attractive, exciting and best to watch team in the entire tournament. Argentina 2015 were so good. They were so fun. 2015 had 2 South American representatives, and one of them made it all the way to that last weekend. And so, those 2 unions decided to meet to discuss growing the game across their continent. And in that meeting, reportedly, apparently, I'm going off what I've heard, what I've read, I wasn't at that meeting, obviously, but supposedly, Hocade made passing reference to an up-and-coming coach plying his trade in the amateur Argentine leagues. A guy by the name of Esteban Meneses, a guy Hocade felt was the most promising coach in Argentina. 1 month later, Meneses was unveiled as the new head coach of the Uruguayan national team. And this is where things really began. Despite a weird rabbit hole history involving possible involvement in political assassinations, the URU basically then became, between 2015 and 2019, the exact model of how a Tier 2 Nations Union should be run. They didn't fall into the tempting trap of appointing a coach on their CV alone, akin to Japan bringing in John Kerwin, or Canada more recently with Kingsley Jones, hiring name recognition coaches who have plenty of experience at the top level, but kind of aren't getting big jobs for a good reason. They appointed a coach who was not only talented, but committed. Whereas Jones went to Canada after being let go by the Dragons, or more recently Andy Robinson to Romania, likely because they were the only real offers on the table, Meneses set out to work hard. This was his big break. He was also a native Spanish speaker, meaning he didn't have the Lynn Jones-Rusher issue of coaching through an interpreter. But more importantly, the URU decided to trust him. The 2015 World Cup generated a record amount of revenue for the URU, and unlike Samoa or Namibia, where the unions are kind of allegedly very corrupt, they reinvested it back into the game. The entire development platform was rejuvenated, seeing Uruguay achieve their 5 best sets of under-20s results in 5 consecutive years. The URU struck a deal with Major League Rugby, managing to push 10 of their players into full-time, proper professional contracts across the league, joining their 4 already on deals in France. And then, knowing Meneses was pushing for greater professionalism, they began signing national team players themselves or helping support them during non-test periods so they could take time out to train and to try and hit the standards the national team needed, rather than focusing on working full-time. And Meneses did his bit, with himself and the other national team coaches travelling Uruguay and taking training sessions at local teams, including age grade sides. And not just the big team academies, just local under-16s clubs. You'd never see Eddie Jones doing this, but that's because Eddie Jones never had to do this. Meneses knew anything but kick ball is a fringe sport in Uruguay, and doing this helped boost interest, participation, and most importantly, standards, because his ultimate new standards were high. Now, Meneses had 2 key phrases he kept going back to. The first of these was the team's motto, and the phrase published so many times in the wake of their win over Fiji: shock the world. And the second was a simple word. He wanted Uruguay to be the protagonists of their every game at the 2019 World Cup. Each of their games in 2015, you were really just tuning in to watch the opposition turn on the style. You were there to watch Fiji for a mad offload, Quade Cooper to try something mental, to see just how deflated England would be having to play a full match after they lost to Australia and Wales and went out in the went out in the pool stage. Uruguay themselves were a sideshow. Meneses wanted to change that script. And in 2019, that became the case. You were transfixed as they beat Fiji. You watched them play Georgia to see if they could pull off a historic second win. And then you wanted to see how these scrappy, wonderful underdogs could push the pool's 2 big boys in the later pool games. Wales were launching an orchestrated and articulated assault for their first title. Australia had Michael Checker saying all sorts of batshittery. Georgia were back after their best ever World Cup in 2015, and Fiji boasted maybe the most irresistible pool of players in the world, including bloody Semi-Radanda. Look at him! Look at him! This guy! They had this guy! That may be the best back in the competition. But the story of Pool D was so often very much Uruguay. We tuned in to see their passion, but we stayed because they had something more. In Meneses' own words, at this level, what makes the difference is detail. And Meneses had spent some time hatching just that. Uruguay used the extra funding granted by World Cup qualification to bring in high-performance coach Craig White. Another piece of proof that Wigan is second only to Waikato for producing top-class coaches. For once, the URU were appointing on strength of the CV. As a high-performance coach, White had won the Heineken Cup with Wasps under Warren Gatland, been on 2 Lions tours, and most relevantly for Uruguay, been behind the scenes of Georgia's 2015 Rugby World Cup, where they themselves caused an upset against a Pacific Island nation and went on to give the bloody All Blacks a pretty good game. White's ability to get a team physically up to scratch mattered, but he put an equal emphasis on the mental side of the game. And I'm not talking about the tactics or decision making I'll come on to later. He, alongside Meneses, began encouraging his team to be open about their emotions. The pair have spoken of team meetings where players told stories of coming from nowhere or overcoming the odds. One player had even beaten cancer. And they've talked of the entire side in those meetings breaking down into tears. Yes, Gamanara's interview after beating Fiji is iconic, but just watch him after they defeated the USA that January.
Seeing them as they tackle, it's really makes me really proud. We do not have many players. We are all from Uruguay. We all live there, and we know that we have to give more than 100% to win these matches. And
he's a man whose emotions are close to the surface, and Uruguay encouraged and championed this, didn't tell him to push it down or hide it. This helped create a unified passion that typified the team, but White also credits this with just giving the players the confidence and, most importantly, trust to tell the man next to them when they were screwing up, when they weren't hitting the standards Meneses expected, and, more importantly, they had now come to expect of each other. Anyone who's seen a cheesy sports movie knows it to be true. The team who cries together wins together. And White's job was just to use any tricks and ideas, anything he could to bring Uruguay as close to the equal playing field as possible, to get them up to standard. And then it was up to Meneses to do just as he suggested, to find the details that make all the difference, that allow them to shock the world. Now, the Esteban Meneses approach to rugby is simple. If you want to win,
we came here to win.
You have to cross the gain line more often than your opposition. However, how you go about this is what changes. That's what needs working out. That's what the coach is there to do. And the fascination is in the detail of just how Meneses made sure Uruguay did this. Because Uruguay do not have a Billy Vunipola, they don't have a Jamie Roberts. Uruguay do not have a pack the size of either of South Africa's. Uruguay do not have the cash or resources to buy in a Tongan willing to qualify in residency. So, they, much like Japan elsewhere in that World Cup, had to be inventive. As such, Uruguay's preparation for the 2019 World Cup was very different to every other side. Whereas everybody else crammed in practice games late on, Uruguay fulfilled their 4-fixture American Rugby Championship commitments. They then played 3 games in June, including Russia on Tuesday before Namibia on a Saturday, to directly mirror the 4-day turnaround between their games against Fiji and Georgia in the World Cup. And then that was it. Uruguay did not play a single minute, a single other match for 3 months before arriving in Kaimashi to smash Fiji over a rock. But in those 7 2019 games, Uruguay started 38 players, and many of them in different positions. Beautiful nerd Felipe Bachesi went on to start all 4 World Cup matches at fly half, yet only played 1 of those 7. With him playing to a high level in France, Meneses could afford to try out some other options at 10 without worrying about rustiness or standard slipping, allowing him to hand the first few caps to precious child Felipe Esteveri and experiment with centre Harmore Cat at standoff. The back row chopped and changed with 10 players occupying 3 positions over 7 games. Thomas Incanate travelled as third choice scrum half, but went on to start against Australia in the centre and played their 7th pre-World Cup match on the wing. He was a utility player who could play anywhere. This was all incredibly deliberate. We saw Warren Gatland do something very similar with Wales, chopping and changing the 15 to see who was and wasn't up to standard. Uruguay had the smallest player pool of any side in that World Cup, with some estimates putting it at just 6,000 registered players. So, Meneses had his work cut out to find 31 of them up to standard. So he spent the first 6 months of the year cycling through as many players as he could, with the plan being to have his full side, his entire World Cup squad, decided by the end of June. Uruguay looked very up and down over the 7 matches, but they were serving a greater purpose. Meneses had to find his 31 best players and had to work out the exact calibration of his squad. He picked this team entirely on merit, not on name recognition or, much like his union, the strength of their CV. Capo Ortega was available and a key figure in qualifying, but left out of the 31, considering he was himself at the time 38. Diego Magno, Uruguay's most cup player, made the squad but didn't start a game at the World Cup, just 2 appearances off the bench. Meneses then also encouraged a rolling boulder of a glorious farmer to slide back into the side after a few years' absence because he felt he was ready, taking the place in the squad of the retiring Mario Segario, who had spent most of his career in France and even 2 years at Munster. He was very much a legend of Uruguayan rugby. The squad was ready, decided, and wrapped in cotton wool well ahead of time, because this gave Meneses a full 3 months to plan. Without the financial pressure from the union to arrange extra games in the way England, Wales, etc. will have had to, he took the bold gamble of arranging no warm-ups and instead focusing all resources on the World Cup itself. He's since said he knew his starting 15, injury allowing, for all 4 games before arriving in Japan. And this allowed him to build a game plan around his team, around the exact personnel, the exact 15, knowing their opposition from the ground up over the course of 3 months. He could build an overall game plan and then tweak it and change it depending on the opposition. Knowing each team in the pool posed a very different threat, Georgia brought power, Fiji brought skills, Australia focused on pace, and Wales were driven by defence. And yet, the way to beat them was always the same. Get over the gain line more often than they do. Regardless of option, Uruguay played to their core strengths. They were not the biggest, they were not the tallest, but they could work harder. Their defence was built to press. It was quite narrow, but that was okay because every player, in particular Nicolas Freitas, worked so hard to get back. Fiji made 21 clean breaks in that opener, which is almost unheard of, but they didn't finish a single one directly. Because the chase back from Uruguay and the cover from fullbacks Gaston Mieres and in the last quarter Felipe Echeverri and fly half Bachesi was so good. And with the ball, they knew they had one thing over virtually every other Tier 2 nation: a fly half with first-class rugby intelligence. Now, I often use Bachesi's rugby fanaticism as a punchline, but there's very little that's valuable to a top-flight team as a 10 who reads the game as well as my boy Felipe. So, having tested his options already, Menezes decided to pile all his stock in Bachesi and rely on him to steer them around the park. All game management sat on his shoulders, which then in turn allowed Nippy 9, Santiago Rata and the uncompromising Augustino Machea to play their natural games from scrum half, rather than worrying about adhering to a game plan. It was on Bachesi to get the best out of the rest of his team, and that allowed Uruguay to get the best out of their nines. Los Teros' shape and systems remained roughly the same throughout the campaign, but it was how they used them that changed. Against Fiji, Uruguay targeted the fringes of both the pitch and the breakdown. Now, John McKee's Fiji adopted a Crusaders-style bend-don't-break defence. The Fijian defence spread out really wide, and this makes it impossible for a player to bust at the middle. As each player is equidistant apart, there's always someone there to hit you. It's like each player is a link in a chain. No one is more important than another. You can push the chain, you can kind of shove it, you can make some meterage, but you can't snap it. You won't be making any clean breaks. When the Crusaders do it, that chain is strung tight. The only real weakness is around the outside, if you can get round the chain. And Uruguay did get plenty of change from that, most notably the try by Harmon Cat, as one failed tackle allowed Mieres to link up with Rodrigo Silva, who just brilliantly hid to deliberately take the tackle from the covering by Takani once his man fixes, meaning both defenders are on him and he can free an arm and put Cat through the flap. However, unlike the Crusaders themselves, Fiji struggled to adapt that defence to tight spaces. It's like the chain was slightly slack in certain places. It's tight enough to hold you back, it's a strong metal chain, but if you push against it in certain spaces, there's ground to be made. Not often clean breaks, but certainly ground. The idea, the theory, is that each defender is equidistant apart, but for this to be effective, you have to trust the players to tighten up dependent on situation, and Fiji at times will just lazily follow the system, meaning sometimes we find forward space as far apart as backs in their own 22 or other tight play situations. This led to carries like this, and also to Mauro Diana's try, as Fiji failed to get proper guards on the fringes, helped partially by a brilliant clean by Gamanara. Uruguay would sporadically abandon a standard 1-3-3-1 or 2-4-2 shape, and just pop forwards in line with these small holes, doing the whole spaces not faces thing, and managing to achieve momentum with carriers who are not the biggest, they are not the tallest, but they came here to cross the gain line. That was their sole objective, and they knew the pressure points they had to press in the Fijian defence in order to achieve it. However, against Georgia, they changed the whole strat. Knowing how Fiji defend and the sheer size of their midfield, I mean, their fly half was 17 stone for crying out loud. Uruguay did not bother sending superb centre Andres Villaseca straight down the middle. They knew he'd be battered back. No gain line success to be found on that channel whatsoever. No. Likewise, they opted for workhorse Mauro Diana at 8 rather than the more established, their usual first choice, carry-bot Alejandro Nieto, knowing Diana's work rate and ability at the breakdown would be needed and would be of more use than number 8 who wasn't going to get much gain against a far bigger Fijian pack anyway. However, against Georgia, Nieto comes in and off their first two set pieces, Uruguay send Villaseca right up the guts. Georgia play more of a drift defence and firing a big lump right into them prevents them doing that. It helps split the defence and forces them to watch the inside man before drifting. The Lele boys are big on putting a back rower, usually the brilliant Becca Gorgadze, in midfield, but keeping their forward around the ruck defensively. And Uruguay's one try, scored by Villaseca himself, came from exploiting just that, hitting the hole of the tailor line-out between the winger and the hooker. It's a very similar move to the one Wales scored off against Georgia the previous week, and then Wales conceded off against England in this year's Six Nations. Their kicking game became much more chase-based, Bachesi and Arata hanging the ball like this, aiming to either compete or smash instead of looking for space and trying to make the ball bounce as they did when kicking to Fiji's incredibly talented back three. The ideas and aims remained the same, but the details changed. Because we've seen plenty of sides turn up at World Cups with spirit, Russia's Vasily Artemyev talked about earning respect, and his side did that, But Uruguay went one better and made themselves the protagonists they wanted to be, rather than just a respected character actor in a metaphorical World Cup movie. And yet, they didn't quite achieve their other goal. Uruguay's glorious and bountiless captain, Juan Manuel Gaminara, said the target for the team was always to win 2 games. That to truly shock the world, they had to back it up and show they were more than passion, that they weren't a fluke. And whilst ultimately they were caught up by Georgia adding a pace to their traditional power, and they fell just short against sides who, relatively speaking, were the biggest and were the tallest and certainly were the richest, they did back it up. There was some really nice rugby against Australia, and they remained in the game until the 73rd minute against Wales, only 1 point behind at half time. Because whereas, say, kick, round, ball has an element of randomness that makes underdog victories like this more likely. The scoring system, the attritional nature of rugby means stories like Uruguay coming from a semi-pro background with no resources to push one of the top teams in the world and beat the side of the most freakishly talented player pool out there don't happen. These stories don't happen. Except, to say that is itself lazy and dull, because they do happen. The difference is, they don't happen through luck. They only happen when the underdog truly deserves it. Stories like this shall always be possible in rugby, and shall always be that much more inspiring, because of the sheer physical efforts and prideful self-belief involved in getting over that line. Stories like these only happen when a team plans correctly, when they prepare right and they work so hard. Stories like this only happen when one team gets all the details right. And most importantly, stories like this only happen when one team truly wants it more.
Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. Hope you're well. Hope you're doing okay. I was just admiring some product placement for a thing I'm going to come on to in just a moment. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you for watching that. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you don't mind. I parked the film club thing for a week. The idea is I'm going to try and mix up what I'm doing. So in amongst the film clubs, I'll be coming back to do Old Scores, a film about a group of players in their 50s and 60s who have to come back and play a rematch of an old match. That's next week. However, in the meantime, I'm just doing a few other kind of deep dives into interesting rugby stories. So that was Uruguay. I'll be doing another one focused on last year's World Cup in a few weeks' time. Don't ask me exactly when, because I want to get it right. I want to work on it properly. On how did the Springboks go from their worst ever world ranking to winning the World Cup, and do a proper detailed dive in the style of that Uruguay video for the Springboks. However, I also want to look at another thing in some detail, which is an old World Cup. I am finally starting an idea me and my brother had in the lead up to the last World Cup. It was something we were talking about doing as a kind of hype building exercise, and now feels perfect that there's no rugby. We can look at this instead. The idea is it's a new spin-off podcast from the channel. We're going to look at an old World Cup. We're going to pick a different World Cup each period and go through every single match from that tournament, doing one episode on each game. So we're going to begin with the 2011 World Cup, because I think it's a really interesting transition phase for rugby. It was kind of moved far enough away from what rugby was in the amateur era, but it wasn't yet what it is now, in this kind of far more tactical and far more articulated by a coach style that it's achieved. So we're going to look at that World Cup. We're going to be slightly nostalgic about it. We're going to have several guests, many guests, come in and give their thoughts on where they were, as well as just running through the game. So it's going to kind of teeter between being hopefully analytical and looking at how the game's changed over the last 10 years, and also hopefully quite funny and doing jokes, and that is the idea. That will be that. Will be coming on Monday, the first episode. There's the RSS feed is in the description. By Monday, hopefully it should be on all kind of major podcast platforms out there for you to do all the subscribing and that. I'd appreciate it if you did. Hopefully it's just giving you some more stuff to watch during this lockdown period as we move towards rugby eventually happening again. And I'll see you when we're 1 week closer to that. Thank you. See you then.
Oh, the big one. Goody's going to reel off all the Uruguayan players' names, and I'm going to reel off all the Fijian names.
Obviously.
Because, you know, Fiji, you talk about a walk in the park, it's going to be a walk in the park, unfortunately, against Uruguayans.
No big shock so far. This isn't going to be it either, do you think?
Oh, definitely not.
heard the experts.